from the audience. So without any further ado, I will now invite Natasha to discuss some of the key ideas presented in her paper, Transitional Justice, Looking Back to Move Forward. Over to you, Natasha.
Thank you very much, Shalanka. First of all, I would like to thank everyone here who has taken an interest in this important conversation, a conversation that does not happen enough, I think. So thank you, SRP, for making this happen for us. So just before I go into it, I want to give a little context about this essay. I wrote this essay with a specific audience in mind. It was done as part of the outreach aspect of the Sri Lanka Barometer project. It was important to go beyond the usual circles who have these conversations. So therefore, even you, or if you get a chance to read the essay, which will hopefully be soon, you would see that the language and tone used was so that it could reach a far greater audience, an audience that who may not be hearing about or who may be hearing about transitional justice for the first time. So for this purpose, SRP has also translated it to Sinhala and Tamil. So hopefully it will reach a good audience when it's published. Another reason I wrote this essay in this way, breaking the usual conventions of academic writing, which I'm used to, is because the term transitional justice, the process and the concept itself has been overly politicized, which has created some common misconceptions that I was hoping to reveal. Before I go into discussing these 4 misconceptions that I've highlighted in the paper, I would like to start off by defining what transitional justice is. Most of us here may already know this, but I'll do this for the benefit of those who may not. In the most simplest sense, transitional justice is a range of processes and mechanisms that are aimed to help a society to come to terms with the violent and painful legacy that was left behind after a civil war. Or after anarchy or a traumatic past. Therefore, justice and accountability is imperative to be able to come to terms with the past, and this applies to the entire nation. So the first common misconception that I have written about is what is commonly believed is that transitional justice is aimed as an attack against the armed forces. But the process itself focuses on victims and with the aim to bring justice to victims who suffered grave violations and loss during the war. In high-level conversations globally, it's never really targeting armed forces per se, because it recognizes that crimes were committed by various parties, including rebel groups, and some of the armed forces, unfortunately, happen to also commit some of these crimes. So to emphasize this more, I would like to quote the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who in her statement made in February 2021 proposed a comprehensive accountability process for all violations and abuses of human rights committed in Sri Lanka by all parties, including those abuses by the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. Therefore, it clearly shows that transitional justice is not an attack against armed forces, but a mechanism that considers all perpetrators of crimes committed during the war. The second misconception I've highlighted is that it is devised by the West to undermine Sri Lanka. This misconception stems from the fact that the transitional justice process is founded on the UN resolution 30/1, but what is not always emphasized is that Sri Lanka co-sponsored this resolution, essentially meaning that it went through a process where the delegation from Sri Lanka and many parties in Sri Lanka that we may not even know of was involved in drafting this resolution, thereby designing the process and mechanism. This was a significant moment for Sri Lanka because it not only showed the international community that Sri Lanka is serious about promoting reconciliation, but more importantly, it signaled to the Tamil community that the government does consider their grievances, and there was a sense of hope that justice will ultimately be served. Although it was a strong move symbolically, practically, the strides were small and the results were barely noticeable. I won't go into what the mechanism entails or the moving parts of it, because I think Prashanti is better placed to talk about it, and I'm pretty sure she will cover those aspects. But I think the most important takeaway here is that Sri Lanka was in control of the process, which leads me to the next misconception, that it threatens the sovereignty of our country. This is commonly heard in political rhetoric, and I think it is important to clarify here that sovereignty, while meaning the authority of a state to govern itself, by no means does this mean that states are protected from facing the consequences of oppressing the rights of their own citizens. This misconception probably also stems from the fact that it seems as if it's a directive coming from outside vis-a-vis the UN resolution. Therefore, it appears as though Sri Lanka does not have the power to make its own decisions when it comes to this issue. However, Sri Lanka played a major role in designing the mechanisms and is the only entity that can actually drive the process forward. Either way, the more we reject the process and fail to take ownership of it, the more we lose our control. In an increasingly interlinked system of global governance, it's vital that Sri Lanka takes a seat at the table in the conversation about Sri Lanka. And the final misconception that I wrote about is that justice is not needed. It's believed that justice is not needed because the war is over, so we can move on. This is a dominant argument, especially coming from the Sinhala ultranationalist camps. And what is important to highlight here in refuting this argument is that in reality, it does not happen this way. We can't close one door and then move to the next without addressing the baggage that was left there. Conflicts take place in cycles. If we do not address the root causes, then there's most definitely a chance of the conflict recurring. We have seen this happening again and again in our history. I won't go into details here, but it is covered in the essay. And we can see for ourselves right now, more than a decade after the end of the war, we still see structural violence playing out in other forms, either through intercommunal or interreligious conflicts. So we must ask ourselves, even though the war is won, is the conflict really over? The root causes of the conflict will prop up over and over again unless justice is served. It is important to take stock of where we have been as a country to make sure that the way forward does not entail repeating past mistakes. I would like to end by reading the final paragraph of the essay, which says, this article explored transitional justice based on the UN resolution, as this was the foundation of the mechanism proposed for Sri Lanka. However, this does not mean that it does not have its flaws. Eventually, any mechanism needs to seriously consider what the people, mainly the victims, want from it. Whatever government is in power needs to listen to these voices and follow through. Ultimately, justice needs to be served with or without a UN resolution. We will be stuck as a country if justice is not served and grievances of victims are not duly addressed, and the past will keep haunting us. Thank you.